I worked the night shift at this old, deserted factory on the outskirts of town. It's a pretty boring gig most of the time, just walking around the perimeter, making sure everything's locked up tight. But one night, things took a turn for the creepy. I was doing my usual rounds, checking all the doors and windows, when I noticed something strange, footprints leading into the building. Now, that's weird enough on its own, but what really freaked me out was the fact that there were no footprints leading back out. It was like whoever had made them had just vanished into thin air. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease and told myself it was probably just some homeless person looking for shelter or something. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. So, I decided to investigate further. I followed the footprints into the building, my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. The factory was huge, with rows and rows of machines that had long since been abandoned. As I made my way deeper into the building, I started to hear strange noises, creaking floorboards, distant footsteps, the sound of something moving in the shadows. I called out, but there was no response. It was like I was completely alone in the darkness, with whatever was making those noises lurking just out of sight. I kept going, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to find the source of the sounds. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any creepier, I saw a figure standing in the shadows, watching me with glowing eyes. I froze, my blood turning to ice in my veins as I stared back at it. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze boring into me, like it was sizing me up, deciding whether I was friend or foe. I wanted to run, to get as far away from the thing as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was like I was under some kind of spell, unable to move or look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving me standing there alone, shaking with fear. I knew I had to get out of there, so I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty halls as I made my way back to the entrance. But no matter how fast I ran, it felt like something was right behind me, breathing down my neck. I burst through the doors and into the night, gasping for air as I stumbled out into the open air. I didn't stop running until I was safely back at my car, far away from the cursed factory. I quit my job the next day, telling my boss I needed some time off to deal with personal issues. But the truth is, I'll never go back to that place, not after what I saw in the darkness. I worked the night shift as a hotel auditor, and let me tell you, some strange things happen in the dead of night. One night, I got a call from a guest complaining about weird noises coming from the room next door. They said it sounded like someone was moving furniture around or banging on the walls. I figured it was just a noisy neighbor, so I went up to the room to check it out. But when I got there, I found the room empty. No one was there, and yet the noises continued, getting louder and more disturbing by the minute. I couldn't explain it. There was no one in the room, but the sounds were unmistakable. It was like they were coming from the walls themselves, as if the very building was alive and trying to tell me something. I tried to brush it off, to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. There was an eerie feeling in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't shake no matter how hard I tried. I decided to investigate further, to see if I could find the source of the noises. I searched the room from top to bottom, checking every nook and cranny for any sign of what could be causing them. But there was nothing, no hidden speakers, no loose pipes, nothing that could explain the strange sounds that filled the air. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any weirder, they did. I heard a voice, a whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably human. It was coming from the room next door, and it sent chills down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself creeping towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I prepared to confront whatever lay on the other side. I reached out and turned the handle, slowly pushing the door open to reveal the empty room beyond. But as I stepped inside, I felt a sudden gust of wind, and the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside with whatever unseen force was at work. I tried to open the door, but it was stuck fast, as if held in place by some invisible hand. Panic set in as I realized I was trapped, alone in a room with no way out and no one to help me. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. The room began to shake, violently at first, as if caught in the grip of a powerful earthquake. I stumbled and fell to the ground, desperately trying to hold on as the world around me spun out of control. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the shaking stopped, leaving me dazed and disoriented on the floor. I struggled to my feet, my head spinning as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. But before I could gather my wits, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere deep within the room. My blood ran cold as I realized I was now alone. There was something else in the room with me, something dark and sinister that meant me harm. I knew I had to get out of there, to escape before whatever it was could do me any harm. I scrambled to my feet and made a break for the door, throwing myself against it with all my strength in a desperate bid for freedom. And then, miraculously, the door gave way, swinging open with a loud creak to reveal the empty hallway beyond. I stumbled out into the corridor, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced towards the safety of the lobby. I didn't stop running until I reached the front desk, where I collapsed in a heap, gasping for breath as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The night auditor on duty rushed over to help me, concern written all over his face as he asked what had happened. But I couldn't find the words to explain it. All I could do was shake my head in disbelief, knowing that I had just narrowly escaped a fate worse than death. It was just like any other night at the shopping mall where I work as a janitor. The place was quiet, the only sounds echoing through the empty corridors were the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of the security cameras. As I made my rounds, sweeping the floors and emptying the trash cans, I noticed something strange, a trail of blood leading from the parking lot to the back entrance of the building. At first, I thought it must be some kind of prank or accident, but as I followed the trail, my heart began to pound in my chest with growing unease. The blood trail led me deeper into the building, twisting and turning through the maze-like corridors until it came to an abrupt end in front of a maintenance closet. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle, my mind racing with horrifying possibilities of what I might find on the other side. But I couldn't turn back now. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside, bracing myself for the worst. What I saw inside the maintenance closet made my blood run cold. There, lying on the floor in a pool of blood, was a body, a man, his face contorted in agony, his eyes wide with fear. I stumbled back in shock, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was clear that this was no accident. Someone had been brutally attacked, and the perpetrator was still out there, somewhere in the building. My first instinct was to call the police, but as I reached for my phone, a noise behind me made me freeze in place. Turning slowly, I saw a shadowy figure lurking in the darkness, their eyes gleaming with malice as they stared back at me. My heart pounding in my chest, I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. With trembling hands, I backed away from the closet, my eyes never leaving the figure in front of me. But as I turned to run, I felt something grab hold of my ankle, sending me sprawling to the ground with a cry of pain. I struggled to break free, kicking and thrashing against my unseen assailant as I fought for my life. But the figure was relentless, their grip like a vice as they dragged me back towards the maintenance closet. With every ounce of strength I had left, I screamed for help, praying that someone, anyone, would hear me and come to my rescue. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing through the corridor. With a surge of adrenaline, I redoubled my efforts, kicking and screaming with renewed fervor as the footsteps drew nearer. And then, just as the figure was about to drag me into the darkness of the maintenance closet, a beam of light pierced the darkness, illuminating the corridor in front of me. It was the security guard, his face a mask of concern as he rushed towards me, his hand outstretched to help me to my feet. Together, we fled from the maintenance closet, racing through the corridors of the shopping mall as we called out for help. And then, finally, we burst through the back entrance of the building, stumbling out into the parking lot where the night air was cool and crisp. As we waited for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling of horror that gripped me. The memory of what I had seen in that maintenance closet burned into my mind like a brand. But despite the terror I had endured, I was alive, and for that, I was grateful. Grateful to the security guard who had come to my rescue. I was just doing my usual delivery route, driving through the rural countryside to drop off packages at various homes and businesses. But this time, I took a wrong turn somewhere, and before I knew it, I was completely lost. I tried to rely on my GPS, but there was no cell service out here in the middle of nowhere. I felt a sense of unease creeping over me as I drove deeper into the unfamiliar territory, surrounded by nothing but fields and forests. As I rounded a bend in the road, I came upon a small village nestled among the trees. It seemed deserted at first glance, with no signs of life anywhere in sight. But as I drove closer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I parked my van and stepped out onto the quiet street, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as I scanned the empty houses for any sign of activity. That's when I noticed them, faces peering out from behind curtains, eyes following my every move with a cold, calculating gaze. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease as I continued down the road, but it only grew stronger with each passing moment. It was like the villagers were sizing me up, assessing me, judging whether I was friend or foe. I quickened my pace, eager to get out of there as quickly as possible. But no matter which way I turned, it seemed like I was only getting further and further from the main road. As I wandered through the deserted streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. It was like the village was hiding a dark secret, one that it would do anything to protect. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, they did. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, like someone was following me, stalking me through the shadows. I turned around, but there was no one there, just an empty street stretching out before me, the houses looming overhead like silent sentinels. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that there was no one there. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel their eyes on me, watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I broke into a run, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the deserted streets, desperate to escape whatever unseen threat was lurking in the shadows. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I saw it, a flicker of light in the distance, the glow of streetlights illuminating the main road beyond. I ran towards it, my lungs burning with exertion as I pushed myself to go faster, to reach safety before it was too late. And then, finally, I burst out onto the main road, gasping for breath as I collapsed on the pavement, the sounds of the village fading into the distance behind me. I reached for my phone, desperate to call for help, but when I looked at the screen, I realized there was no signal, not here, not anywhere in this godforsaken place. I felt a sense of despair wash over me as I realized I was truly alone, stranded in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. But just as I was about to give up hope, I heard the sound of an engine revving in the distance, the headlights of a car cutting through the darkness as it approached. I stumbled to my feet, waving my arms frantically as I tried to flag down the passing vehicle. And to my relief, it slowed to a stop, the driver rolling down the window to ask if I needed a ride. I climbed into the car, grateful for the chance to escape the nightmare that had engulfed me. And as we drove away into the night, leaving the isolated village behind us, It was just another late-night shift at the 24-hour diner where I worked as a cook. The last customers had left, and the place was eerily quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights above me. As I wiped down the counters and prepared to close up for the night, I heard a strange noise coming from the kitchen, a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. At first, I thought it might be one of the other employees, but when I called out, there was no answer. Curiosity getting the better of me, I made my way towards the kitchen, my heart pounding in my chest with a growing sense of unease. As I entered the kitchen, the first thing I noticed was the freezer door, wide open, with cold air spilling out into the room. My stomach turned as I saw a trail of blood leading from the freezer door into the darkness beyond. With trembling hands, I followed the trail, my mind racing with horrifying possibilities of what I might find on the other side. But as I stepped into the freezer, what I saw made my blood run cold. There, lying on the floor, was a body, a man, his eyes white with terror, his clothes soaked with blood. I stumbled back in shock, my mind reeling as I tried to process what I was seeing. It was clear that this was no accident. Someone had been attacked, and the perpetrator was still out there, somewhere in the diner. My first instinct was to call the police, but as I reached for my phone, I heard a noise behind me that made me freeze in place. Turning slowly, I saw a figure lurking in the shadows, their eyes gleaming with malice as they stared back at me. My heart pounding in my chest, I knew I had to get out of there, and fast. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, racing through the kitchen and out into the dining area. But as I reached the front door, I felt something grab hold of my arm, pulling me back with a strength that I had never known. I struggled against my assailant, fighting for my life as they dragged me back towards the kitchen. With every ounce of strength I had left, I screamed for help, praying that someone, anyone, would hear me and come to my rescue. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, I heard the sound of footsteps approaching from the other side of the diner. With a surge of relief, I redoubled my efforts, kicking and screaming with renewed fervor as the footsteps drew nearer. And then, finally, the door burst open, and the police rushed in, their guns drawn as they surveyed the scene in front of them. With a sense of overwhelming gratitude, I collapsed to the ground, tears streaming down my face as I realized that I was safe once more. The police quickly apprehended the perpetrator, a deranged man who had been hiding in the diner, waiting for an opportunity to strike. As they led him away in handcuffs, I couldn't shake the feeling of horror that gripped me. The memory of what I had seen in the kitchen burned into my mind like a brand. But despite the terror I had endured, I was alive, and for that, I was grateful. Grateful to the police who had come to my rescue. My name is Stuart. Friends call me Stu. I'm just a custodian at the university, you know, doing my rounds, cleaning up after the students and all that. It's a pretty straightforward job most of the time, but one night, things got weird. I was down in the basement of the library, mopping the floors and taking out the trash, when I noticed something strange, a door that I'd never seen before. It was tucked away in a corner, hidden behind a stack of old crates. Curiosity got the better of me, so I decided to take a look. I opened the door and stepped inside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon. What I found inside was, well, it was like something out of a horror movie. The room was filled with dusty old books, piled high on shelves that stretched up to the ceiling. And all around the walls were these strange symbols, carved into the stone like they'd been there for centuries. I didn't know what to make of it at first, but the longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt. There was something about the air in that room, something heavy and oppressive, like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. I tried to shake off the feeling and focus on my work, but every time I turned my back, I felt like something was breathing down my neck. It was like the shadows themselves were alive, moving and shifting in the darkness. I couldn't take it anymore, so I decided to get out of there. But just as I was about to leave, I heard something, a faint whispering sound, like someone speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen. It was coming from somewhere deep within the room, hidden in the shadows. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that room as possible, but something kept me rooted to the spot. It was like I was under some kind of spell, unable to move or look away. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The room was silent once more, the only sound the pounding of my own heartbeat. I took that as my cue to leave, and I practically ran out of there, my heart racing and my hands shaking. I didn't stop until I was safely back upstairs, far away from that cursed room. I tried to tell my supervisor about what I'd found, but he just brushed it off like it was nothing. He said it was probably just some old storage room or something, and that I shouldn't worry about it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something dark and sinister lurking in the depths of that basement. And I made a promise to myself that I would never go back down there again. It was a typical night at the dispatch office for roadside assistance. The phone had been ringing off the hook with calls from stranded motorists, but this one was different. The caller's voice was tense as they described seeing a figure standing by the side of the road, watching them. They sounded genuinely scared, which sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly assured them that help was on the way, dispatching a tow truck to their location. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I glanced at the clock. It was nearly midnight, and couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle over me. As I waited for the tow truck to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that the caller wasn't alone out there on the dark, deserted road. Minutes felt like hours as I anxiously monitored the GPS tracker on the tow truck, willing it to reach the caller's location safely. And then, finally, the truck arrived, but there was no sign of the stranded motorist. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to reach the caller again, but their phone was going straight to voicemail. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I knew that something was terribly wrong. I quickly alerted the authorities, relaying all the information I had about the caller's location and the mysterious figure they had seen. As I waited for news, my mind raced with horrifying possibilities. What if the caller had been abducted? What if they were in danger? Minutes turned into hours as I waited anxiously for any word from the authorities. And then, finally, the phone rang. It was the police, and they had news. They had found the caller's car abandoned on the side of the road, but there was no sign of the caller anywhere. My heart sank as I realized that the worst-case scenario had come true. The caller had disappeared without a trace. As the days passed with no sign of the missing motorist, I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt that gnawed at me. If only I had acted faster, if only I had sent help sooner, maybe things would have turned out differently. But deep down, I knew that there was something more sinister at play here, something beyond my control. Weeks turned into months, and still, there was no sign of the missing motorist. The case remained unsolved, a dark shadow hanging over the small town where it had all begun. But even as life returned to normal for everyone else, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of my mind. Because deep down, I knew that whatever had happened to the missing motorist could happen to anyone, and that thought terrified me more than anything else. I work as a nurse at a psychiatric hospital, which is usually a pretty normal job. But one night, things got really creepy. It was during the late shift, and the hospital was quiet. I was going about my rounds, checking on the patients and making sure everything was okay. That's when I heard laughter. It was coming from one of the patient rooms, but when I went to check, there was no one there. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but then I heard it again. It was unsettling, like someone was laughing at a joke only they understood. I decided to investigate further, so I went to the room where the laughter was coming from. When I opened the door, it was empty. But then I heard more laughter, coming from another room down the hall. I went to check it out, and again, there was no one there. At this point, I was starting to feel really uneasy. I've worked at the hospital for years, and I've never experienced anything like this before. I went back to the nurse's station and told my colleagues what I'd heard. They looked at me like I was crazy, but I could tell they were feeling nervous too. We decided to keep an eye on the patients, just in case. But as the night went on, things only got weirder. Patients who had been calm and lucid earlier in the day were now acting agitated and hysterical. They were all saying the same thing: they'd seen something in the shadows. I tried to reassure them, to tell them it was just their imagination playing tricks on them. But deep down, I knew there was something off about the whole situation. That's when I saw it, a shadow, moving across the wall. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before, dark and twisted, with glowing eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. I froze in terror, unable to move as the shadow crept closer. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. I knew I had to get out of there, so I grabbed my things and made a beeline for the door. But as I was leaving, I heard one last thing: the sound of laughter echoing through the empty halls. I don't know what was going on at the hospital that night, but I'm sure of one thing: it was something I never want to experience again. It was a quiet night at the museum, just like any other. I was doing my rounds, checking the security cameras and making sure everything was in order. But as I glanced at the monitors, I noticed something strange. There were fluctuations in the video feed, like someone was tampering with the cameras. My heart skipped a beat as I tried to pinpoint the source of the interference. It didn't take long for me to realize that it was coming from the Egyptian exhibit. I hurried down the darkened corridors, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I made my way towards the exhibit. As I entered the room, I felt a chill run down my spine. The artifacts, the priceless relics that had been carefully preserved for centuries, were gone. Panic surged through me as I realized that someone had broken into the museum and stolen the artifacts right out from under our noses. I frantically searched the exhibit, hoping to find some clue as to who had done this and why. But as I scanned the room, my heart sank. There was nothing. No sign of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to indicate who could have pulled off such a daring heist. I knew I had to act fast. I rushed back to the security office and called the police, telling them everything I had seen and heard. As I waited for them to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. Who could have done this? And why? Minutes felt like hours as I waited for the police to arrive. Every creak of the building, every rustle of the wind outside made me jump. And then, finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Relief washed over me as I realized that help was on the way. The police arrived and began their investigation, dusting for fingerprints and combing through the security footage. But as they worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It was like there was something lurking in the shadows, watching us, waiting to strike. As the hours ticked by, the police found no trace of the thieves or the stolen artifacts. It was like they had vanished into thin air. I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread settle over me as I realized that whoever had done this was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of the thieves or the stolen artifacts. The museum remained closed to the public as the investigation continued. But even as life returned to normal for everyone else, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that lingered in the back of my mind. Because deep down, I knew that the museum was still not safe, that whoever had stolen the artifacts could strike again at any moment. I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, like someone, or something, was waiting for the perfect moment to make their move. And as I looked out at the empty museum, I couldn't help but wonder, would we ever catch the thieves? I was doing my rounds as usual, working the night shift at the animal shelter. It was a quiet night, with only the sound of the occasional bark or meow breaking the silence. As I made my way through the rows of cages, checking on the animals and making sure they were comfortable, I heard a faint scratching sound coming from the isolation ward. At first, I thought it was just one of the animals trying to get out of its cage. But as I listened closer, the sound seemed more deliberate, more purposeful, like someone or something was trying to get my attention. My heart began to race as I approached the isolation ward, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty hallway. The scratching grew louder with each step, sending shivers down my spine. I reached the door to the isolation ward and hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't know what to expect on the other side, but I knew I had to find out. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with only a few flickering fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the walls. And that's when I saw it, a figure hunched over one of the cages, its back turned to me as it continued to scratch at the metal bars. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I watched the intruder. Who could it be? What were they doing here? I took a step closer, my hand reaching for the light switch on the wall. But before I could flick it on, the figure suddenly stopped scratching and turned towards me. In the dim light, I could see its eyes glinting in the darkness, cold and calculating. My blood ran cold as I realized that this was no ordinary intruder. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Who or what was this person, and why were they here in the isolation ward? But before I could think of an answer, the figure lunged towards me, its hands reaching out as if to grab me. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I tried to dodge out of the way. I managed to duck behind one of the cages, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself down. But the figure was relentless, its footsteps echoing loudly in the empty room as it searched for me. I knew I had to get out of there, to find help before it was too late. With a burst of adrenaline, I bolted towards the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I prayed that it would open. To my relief, it did, and I stumbled out into the hallway, my lungs burning as I ran for my life. I could hear the figure following close behind, its footsteps growing louder with each passing second. But I refused to look back, refused to let fear consume me. I just kept running, my legs pumping as fast as they could go until I reached the safety of the main office. I slammed the door shut behind me, my chest heaving as I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath. I was safe for now, but I knew that the figure was still out there, still lurking in the darkness, waiting for its next opportunity to strike. I knew I had to warn someone, to get help before it was too late. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone on the desk and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I tried to explain what had happened. The operator listened patiently as I recounted my harrowing encounter, promising to send help right away. But even as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me like a dark cloud. I knew that the figure was still out there, still waiting in the shadows for its next victim. I was working the graveyard shift at the gas station, just like any other night. It was quiet, with only the occasional car passing through, their headlights slicing through the darkness as they made their way along the deserted highway. But then, I noticed something strange, a car parked at the pumps, its engine running, but no driver in sight. I frowned, wondering if maybe they had gone inside to pay or use the restroom. I stepped out from behind the counter and made my way over to the car, my heart pounding in my chest as I peered inside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The driver was slumped over the steering wheel, their eyes wide open and unseeing. I reached out to touch their shoulder, but pulled back at the last moment, a sense of unease washing over me. Something wasn't right here, and I didn't want to get any closer than I had to. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. Should I call the police? Wake them up and see if they're okay? Or just leave them be and hope they wake up on their own? But then, I noticed something else, a strange smell emanating from the car, something sickly sweet and metallic, like copper mixed with rotting fruit. It made my stomach churn, and I knew I couldn't just leave them there like that. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I dialed 911 and explained the situation to the operator. They assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay put until the police arrived. I hung up the phone and took a step back from the car, feeling a sense of relief wash over me. But it was short-lived, as I heard a low, guttural growl coming from somewhere nearby. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any sign of movement. But all I could hear was the sound of my own ragged breathing and the distant hum of the highway. I told myself it was just my imagination, that there was nothing out there in the darkness waiting to get me. But deep down, I knew better. I could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I glanced around nervously, searching for any sign of movement in the shadows. But all I could see was the empty expanse of the gas station parking lot, bathed in the harsh glow of the overhead lights. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that gripped me. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. There was nothing out there, nothing to be afraid of. But then, I heard it again, the low, guttural growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching on gravel. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin as I realized that whatever was out there wasn't human. It was something else, something far more dangerous, and it was coming for me. I glanced back at the car, wondering if maybe I should hide inside until help arrived. But then, I remembered the driver, still slumped over the steering wheel, their eyes wide open and unseeing. I knew I couldn't just leave them there, not with whatever was out there lurking in the darkness. So, I made a split-second decision and ran back inside the gas station, locking the door behind me. I grabbed a baseball bat from behind the counter, my hands trembling as I waited for the police to arrive. But as the minutes ticked by, it felt like an eternity, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that gnawed at my insides. And then, just when I thought all hope was lost, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance, growing closer and closer with each passing moment. I breathed a sigh of relief, knowing that help was finally on the way. But then, I heard something else, a loud crash as something slammed into the front door of the gas station, followed by the sound of shattering glass. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that whatever was out there had found a way inside. I gripped the baseball bat tighter in my hands, ready to defend myself against whatever horrors lay beyond the door. But as I braced myself for the worst, the door swung open and a flood of light spilled into the room, revealing a group of police officers standing on the other side. I let out a sigh of relief, dropping the baseball bat to the ground as I rushed forward to greet them. They quickly took control of the situation, securing the gas station and ensuring that I was safe. As they led me outside, I couldn't help but glance back at the car, still parked at the pumps with the engine running. But the driver was nowhere to be seen, their fate a mystery that would haunt me for the rest of my days. It was just another typical night at the dive bar where I worked as a bartender. The usual crowd of regulars was there, drowning their sorrows in cheap beer and whiskey, while the jukebox blared out classic rock tunes in the background. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something strange, a group of strangers sitting in the corner booth, their faces hidden in the shadows. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, it wasn't uncommon for shady characters to come through the doors of the bar. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about them. They never spoke, never laughed, never even touched their drinks. They just sat there, staring straight ahead with an intensity that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to ignore them, to focus on the other patrons at the bar. But every time I glanced over at the booth, I felt a sense of dread creeping over me, like something terrible was about to happen. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any stranger, one of the strangers caught my eye. Their face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see their eyes, cold, lifeless, devoid of any emotion. I forced myself to look away, to concentrate on my work and pretend like everything was normal. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something wrong with those people, something unnatural, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what it was. But then, as I was wiping down the bar, one of them got up and started walking towards me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as they approached, their movements slow and deliberate. I tried to maintain my composure, to act like everything was fine. But inside, I was terrified, wondering what they wanted from me and if I would ever make it out of this alive. They finally reached the bar and leaned in close, their breath hot against my ear as they whispered something that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't make out the words, but I could feel the menace in their voice, the threat hanging in the air like a dark cloud. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but I was frozen in place, unable to move as they stared at me with those cold, lifeless eyes. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a commotion from the other side of the bar. I turned to see one of the other patrons standing up, a look of horror on their face as they pointed towards the strangers in the corner booth. I followed their gaze and felt my blood run cold as I saw what they were pointing at. The strangers were changing, their bodies contorting and twisting in ways that shouldn't be possible. I watched in horror as their skin peeled back, revealing something dark and twisted underneath. Their eyes glowed with an otherworldly light as they lunged forward, their mouths opening impossibly wide to reveal rows of sharp, jagged teeth. I knew then that I had to get out of there, to escape before it was too late. I turned and ran for the back door, my heart pounding in my chest as I heard the sound of screams and chaos behind me. I burst out into the alley behind the bar and kept running, not stopping until I was far away from that place, far away from those things. I never went back to that dive bar again, and I never found out what happened to those strangers in the corner booth. But I'll never forget the terror I felt that night, the fear of knowing that there are things out there in the world that defy explanation. It was a quiet night, and I was on my usual shift as a paramedic, ready to respond to any emergency that came our way. The radio crackled to life with a call from dispatch, a report of a disturbance at a remote farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Without hesitation, I revved up the ambulance and raced to the scene, the darkness swallowing the road ahead as I drove. As I arrived, the farmhouse loomed ahead, isolated in the stillness of the night. My heart raced as I approached the front door, the sense of dread growing with each step. I pushed open the door and entered cautiously, calling out for anyone who might be in need of help. But there was no response, only silence that seemed to stretch on forever. As I made my way through the house, a sickening feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. And then, I found them, a family, slaughtered in their beds, their blood staining the sheets and the walls around them. Horror washed over me as I realized the magnitude of what had happened here. I stumbled back, my mind reeling with disbelief and fear. Who could have done this? And why? But there was no time to dwell on these questions. I had to focus on finding any survivors and getting them to safety. With trembling hands, I continued my search, checking every room of the farmhouse for any sign of life. But there was nothing, only the echoes of my own footsteps as I moved through the darkness. As I reached the last room, a sense of dread washed over me. I knew that I was about to uncover something terrible, something that would haunt me for the rest of my days. I pushed open the door and entered cautiously, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. And then, I saw him, a man, standing in the corner of the room, his eyes wild with madness. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that the killer was still here, still lurking in the shadows. Without a word, the man lunged at me, his hands reaching out with a deadly intent. I dodged out of the way just in time, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I fought to defend myself. We struggled, grappling with each other in the darkness as the room seemed to close in around us. But I refused to give up, determined to stop this madman before he could harm anyone else. With a burst of strength, I managed to overpower him, pinning him to the ground as I called for backup on my radio. Minutes felt like hours as I waited for help to arrive, every second stretching out into eternity. But finally, I heard the sound of sirens approaching in the distance. Relief washed over me as the police burst into the room, taking the killer into custody and securing the scene. As I stepped out into the cool night air, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude that I had survived, that I had been able to stop the killer before it was too late. It was a regular night shift at the theme park where I worked as a security officer. The park was closed, and my job was to make sure everything was in order and that there were no unauthorized visitors lurking around. As I made my rounds, I noticed something odd, strange activity in the closed-off area of the park. Lights flickering, shadows moving where they shouldn't be. I felt a chill run down my spine as I approached cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. As I got closer, I heard voices, whispers, laughter, the sound of footsteps echoing through the night. My heart pounded in my chest as I realized that there were people in the park, people who shouldn't be there. I crept closer, my senses on high alert as I tried to catch a glimpse of the intruders. And then, I saw them, a group of figures huddled together, moving furtively through the shadows. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, I remembered my training. It was my duty to protect the park and its guests, no matter what. With a deep breath, I stepped forward, shining my flashlight on the trespassers and ordering them to freeze. They froze, startled by the sudden light, their faces twisted in fear and surprise. I could see now that they were just teenagers, probably looking for a thrill on a late-night adventure. But that didn't excuse their behavior. They were breaking the law, and I couldn't let them get away with it. I approached them cautiously, keeping my distance as I demanded to know what they were doing in the park after hours. They stammered and stuttered, trying to come up with an excuse, but I wasn't buying it. I radioed for backup, knowing that I would need help to deal with the trespassers. But as I waited for assistance to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about these kids, something sinister lurking beneath the surface. As we waited for backup to arrive, the tension in the air grew thick, the silence broken only by the sound of our breathing and the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. And then, without warning, one of the kids lunged at me, a knife glinting in his hand. I dodged out of the way just in time, adrenaline coursing through my veins as I fought to defend myself. We struggled, grappling with each other in the darkness as the other kids looked on in horror. But I refused to back down, determined to protect myself and the park from these dangerous intruders. With a burst of strength, I managed to overpower the knife-wielding teenager, pinning him to the ground as I waited for backup to arrive. Minutes felt like hours as we waited for help to arrive, the tension in the air palpable as we held our breath, waiting for the sound of approaching sirens. And then, finally, the sound we had been waiting for, the blaring of sirens as backup arrived on the scene, taking the trespassers into custody and securing the area. As I stepped back from the chaos, my heart still racing from the encounter, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief that I had survived, that I had been able to protect myself and the park from harm. I was working my usual night shift as a security officer at the university, patrolling the campus to ensure everything was safe and secure. It was a quiet night, with only the occasional sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors. As I made my rounds, I heard a faint sound coming from the direction of the library. It was a low, rhythmic chanting that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, trying to brush it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. But the chanting grew louder as I approached the library, echoing off the walls and filling the air with an eerie energy. I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer, so I made my way inside, my heart pounding in my chest. The library was dark and deserted, the only light coming from the dim overhead fixtures. I followed the sound of the chanting down to the basement, where it grew louder with each step I took. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I froze in horror at what I saw. A group of students stood in a circle, their faces twisted in concentration as they chanted in unison. In the center of the circle was a makeshift altar, adorned with candles and strange symbols. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was like something out of a nightmare. But there was no time to waste. I had to stop them before it was too late. I stepped forward, my voice shaking as I called out to them, demanding to know what they were doing. But they ignored me, their chanting growing louder and more frantic with each passing moment. I reached for my radio, intending to call for backup, but before I could do anything, one of the students turned towards me, their eyes blazing with an otherworldly intensity. And then, without warning, they lunged at me, their hands reaching out with a terrifying intent. I stumbled backward, barely managing to dodge out of the way in time. The other students joined in, their movements fluid and coordinated as they closed in on me from all sides. I was outnumbered and outmatched, my only option to fight for my life. I ducked and weaved, dodging their blows as best as I could. But they were relentless, their attacks coming at me from every direction. I managed to land a few hits of my own, but it wasn't enough to stop them. They were like a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding in their pursuit of whatever dark purpose they were serving. Just when I thought I couldn't hold out any longer, I saw a glimmer of hope, the sound of approaching footsteps echoing down the stairs. Backup had arrived, and just in time. With renewed determination, I fought back with everything I had, using every ounce of strength and skill to fend off my attackers. Together, we managed to overpower them, restraining them and securing the scene until the authorities could arrive to take them into custody. As I caught my breath, I couldn't help but wonder what had driven those students to perform such a dark and sinister ritual. What were they trying to achieve, and what would have happened if we hadn't stopped them in time? It was a chilling reminder that evil could lurk in even the most unexpected of places, and that it was up to people like me to stand up and fight against it, no matter the cost. I was in the middle of my night shift at the garage, working away on some routine maintenance tasks, when I heard the faint sound of scratching coming from the back room where we kept the abandoned cars. At first, I tried to brush it off as just the building settling or maybe a stray animal outside, but the scratching grew louder and more persistent with each passing minute. I couldn't ignore it any longer. With a sense of unease creeping over me, I decided to go investigate. As I made my way to the back room, the scratching grew louder, echoing off the walls of the garage and sending shivers down my spine. When I reached the door to the back room, I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't know what I would find on the other side, but I knew I had to find out. With a deep breath, I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dark and musty, the air heavy with the smell of oil and gasoline. The scratching was deafening now, filling the room with an eerie sense of foreboding. I flicked on the light switch, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The abandoned cars were covered in scratches and dents, as if something or someone had been trying to claw its way out. I approached one of the cars cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest as I ran my hand along the scratches. They were deep and jagged, as if whatever had made them was desperate to escape. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me, to convince myself that there must be a logical explanation for what I was seeing. But deep down, I knew that something was very wrong. I continued to explore the back room, searching for any clues that might explain the strange phenomenon. That's when I noticed it, a small, dark stain on the floor, barely visible in the dim light. I knelt down to get a closer look, my heart sinking as I realized what it was. It was blood, a small pool of it, dried and caked onto the concrete floor. My mind raced with fear and uncertainty. Who or what had been in this room? And why had they left in such a hurry? I knew I had to get out of there, to find help before it was too late. With a sense of urgency, I hurried back to the main garage, my footsteps echoing loudly in the empty building. But as I reached the door, I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from behind me. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned to face whatever or whoever was approaching. And that's when I saw him, a figure standing in the shadows, his eyes glinting in the dim light. I didn't recognize him, but there was something about him that sent a chill down my spine. I backed away slowly, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. But before I could make a move, the figure lunged towards me, his hands reaching out as if to grab me. I stumbled backwards, my heart racing as I tried to dodge out of the way. But he was too fast, too strong, and before I knew it, he had me pinned against the wall, his hands tightening around my throat. I struggled to break free, to scream for help, but his grip was like iron, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I could feel myself growing weaker by the second, my vision beginning to blur as darkness closed in around me. And then, just when I thought it was all over, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Help had arrived, just in the nick of time. With a final burst of strength, I managed to break free from the figure's grasp, collapsing to the ground as the police burst into the garage, their guns drawn and ready. The figure tried to flee, but the police were too quick for him. They apprehended him before he could get away, leading him away in handcuffs as I watched from the floor, gasping for breath and trying to make sense of what had just happened. As the adrenaline began to fade, I realized that I had narrowly escaped a brush with death. The scratching, the blood, the mysterious figure, they were all pieces of a puzzle that I would never fully understand. But one thing was clear, I would never forget the terror of that night, the feeling of being hunted by something dark and malevolent. And as I lay there on the ground, surrounded by police and flashing lights, I knew that I would never be the same again. I worked the night shift as a nurse at a local hospital, which means I've seen my fair share of strange things. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered one fateful night. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard the whispers, soft, almost imperceptible, but undeniably present. At first, I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, hospitals can be eerie places at night, with all the creaks and groans of the building settling in the silence. But the whispers persisted, growing louder and more insistent with each passing moment. Curiosity getting the better of me, I decided to investigate, telling myself it was probably just a patient in distress or perhaps a colleague talking softly on the phone. As I approached the source of the whispers, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The room was supposed to be empty. I had checked the patient roster earlier, and there were no occupants listed for that particular room. I cautiously pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly in protest. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. The room was bathed in an eerie red light, casting strange shadows on the walls. And there, in the center of the room, were symbols drawn in what looked like blood, covering every available surface. My heart pounding in my chest, I stepped closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But the symbols were like nothing I had ever seen before, twisted and grotesque, like something out of a nightmare. And then, I heard it, a soft rustling sound coming from the corner of the room. I froze, my breath catching in my throat as I waited, terrified of what might emerge from the darkness. Seconds stretched into eternity as I stood there, paralyzed with fear. And then, from the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a figure clad in dark robes, its face obscured by a hood. I wanted to run, to scream for help, but something held me in place, rooted to the spot as the figure approached. It spoke then, its voice barely more than a whisper, but filled with a cold, malevolent energy that sent shivers down my spine. "Do not be afraid," it said, its words sending a chill through the air. "We mean you no harm." But I didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. There was something about the figure, something about the way it moved, that filled me with a deep sense of dread. I backed away slowly, my eyes never leaving the figure's hooded face. And then, without warning, it lunged forward, its hand reaching out to grab me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest as I turned and fled, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding before me. As I ran, I could hear the figure's laughter echoing in my ears, taunting me with promises of darkness and despair. I didn't stop running until I reached the safety of the hospital's main lobby, where I collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath. It took me a moment to compose myself, to gather the courage to tell someone what had happened. But when I finally did, no one believed me. They said it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination brought on by the stress of working the night shift. But I know what I saw, I know the truth. And though I may never be able to explain it, I will never forget the terror of that night, or the chilling whispers that still haunt my dreams.